Sarah Collins was 16 years old and had mastered the art of blending into the background at Oakwood High School. Her small, slight frame made her an easy target for ridicule, but it was her quiet demeanor that often left her invisible. However, beneath her reserved exterior, Sarah harbored a fierce determination born from years of learning to protect herself in silence. Her sanctuary was a rundown boxing gym on the edge of town, where the clang of weights and rhythmic punches offered a reprieve from the taunts of her peers. She first stepped into the gym at 12 years old, clutching a pair of second-hand gloves. Coach Martinez, a grizzled veteran with a soft spot for underdogs, spotted her immediately. There was something about her, the way she carried her shoulders, tense but steady, her gaze unwavering as she sized up the heavy bag. When her first tentative jab landed with unexpected precision, Coach Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Kid, you've got something," he muttered. "Stay focused, and you'll go far." Her parents, John and Ellen, were cautiously supportive. They had always known Sarah to be determined, but they worried about the dangers her training might attract. What if the wrong people find out? Ellen fretted over dinner one evening. "Kids can be cruel, John. They'll twist anything into a weapon." John, ever the practical one, responded calmly, "She's learning to defend herself, Ellen. That's more than we could ever teach her." Yet, the weight of their worry hung over Sarah like a storm cloud. Sarah confided in her only true friend, Melissa. The two had bonded years earlier during a science project, and Melissa had been a steady ally ever since. "You've got this fire inside you, Sarah," Melissa said one afternoon as they lingered near their lockers. "Don't let them snuff it out." Sarah's lips twitched into a rare smile, and for a fleeting moment, she believed it. But Oakwood High School had its own ecosystem of predators. At the top of the food chain was Jake Peterson, a towering senior whose cruel smirk was enough to send younger students scattering. Flanked by his sidekicks, Liam Carter and Travis Brown, Jake seemed to relish targeting Sarah. Liam followed Jake's lead out of fear of being a target himself, while Travis, though uneasy, lacked the courage to break away from the group. Together, they were an unrelenting storm that seemed determined to make Sarah's life miserable. Every encounter was a battle of endurance for Sarah. Jake's sneering voice echoed in her mind as she walked home each day. "What are you hiding under all that hair, Collins? A face, or another failure?" she recalled him saying one morning as his cronies cackled. The weight of their words felt heavier than any dumbbell she had ever lifted at the gym. But Sarah clung to the principles Coach Martinez drilled into her: control your power. Your mind is your strongest weapon. Her resolve was tested daily. One afternoon, as Sarah trudged home, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, a shadow loomed behind her. Jake and his crew. She quickened her pace, heart pounding, but Jake called after her. "Hey, Collins. Got somewhere better to be?" His voice dripped with mockery. Turning down a side street, she ignored him, but her fists clenched. Every instinct screamed for her to turn and fight, but she kept walking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The echo of laughter followed her all the way home. At dinner that night, her mother noticed Sarah's unease. "Everything okay at school?" Ellen asked, her voice soft but probing. Sarah hesitated before nodding. "It's fine, Mom," she lied, staring at her plate. John glanced up from his newspaper but said nothing, though his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. That evening, Sarah retreated to her room and pulled out her gloves. The cracked leather fit her hands like a second skin, and the familiar weight grounded her. She replayed the day's events in her mind as she shadowboxed, imagining herself standing up to Jake, planting her feet firmly, her fists landing blow after blow. But as quickly as the fantasy came, it dissolved into reality. She was still the quiet girl, the easy target, the one too afraid to fight back. The next morning, Melissa greeted Sarah at the lockers with a knowing look. "They were at it again, weren't they?" she asked. Sarah nodded, her eyes darting around the hallway. "Jake doesn't know when to quit." Melissa sighed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than them. One day, they'll figure that out." But the bullies weren't the only ones testing Sarah's patience. The school administration turned a blind eye to the torment she faced, dismissing her complaints as minor incidents. Principal Patterson had assured her parents that Oakwood had a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, yet Jake and his gang roamed the hallways unchecked. It was as if the school's walls whispered complicity, a silent pact to protect the status quo. At the gym, Coach Martinez noticed Sarah's focus slipping. Her punches lacked their usual precision, and her footwork grew clumsy. "What's going on, Collins?" he barked one evening, his sharp tone breaking through her haze. "You're fighting like your mind's somewhere else." Sarah hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "It's just school stuff. People who think they can push me around." Coach Martinez's expression softened slightly. "Look, kid, the ring teaches you more than just how to fight. It's about discipline, self-control. You don't fight unless you have to. But when you do, you don't lose." His words resonated with Sarah as she walked home that night, her gloves slung over her shoulder like a badge of honor. She thought about the lessons she had learned in the gym, the hours spent perfecting her form, and the quiet strength that came from knowing her own power. But she also thought about Jake, Liam, and Travis, their jeering faces, their careless cruelty. The tension in her chest tightened. Could she use what she had learned to defend herself, or would she risk becoming like them? As she lay awake that night, Sarah replayed Coach Martinez's advice in her mind. Control your power. Don't let them define who you are. But control felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The storm brewing inside her was growing stronger, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it would break free. The following weeks tested Sarah's patience and resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Jake Peterson's cruelty escalated, each encounter more invasive and humiliating than the last. What had once been whispered insults and minor inconveniences grew into a calculated campaign of torment. The trio cornered her in the school's east corridor one morning, the one place where the flickering lights and peeling paint guaranteed no witnesses. "Lost again, Collins?" Jake sneered, stepping into her path. His bulky frame loomed over her, blocking any chance of escape. Liam and Travis flanked him, their laughter sharp and cruel. "Maybe we should help her find her way," Liam jeered, his words dripping with mockery. Sarah's heart raced, her breaths shallow and quick. She felt the heat rising to her face, a mixture of fear and anger. She tightened her grip on her books, forcing herself to stand taller, but her legs felt like lead. Jake's smirk widened as he leaned closer, his voice low enough to make her skin crawl. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Sarah's silence seemed to fuel their laughter. As they walked away, their taunts echoed in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. She made her way to class, her hands trembling as she gripped her desk. The humiliation didn't stop there. During a group presentation in English literature, Sarah's carefully crafted slides were replaced with a grotesque photo montage of her face, distorted and surrounded by cruel captions. The classroom erupted in laughter as Jake and Liam sat in the back, their smug expressions confirming their handiwork. For a moment, Sarah froze. The humiliation was paralyzing, her cheeks burning with the weight of 100 stares. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the teacher's attempts to regain control. She turned her gaze downward, muttering an apology, and fled the room. Behind her, the laughter felt like a noose tightening around her. In the bathroom, she gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection. Her breath came in ragged gasps, tears threatening to spill over. "I'm not a punching bag," she whispered to herself, her knuckles whitening as she clenched the porcelain. The words felt hollow in the moment, but she repeated them like a mantra, hoping they might eventually ring true. Melissa found her there, her usually bright demeanor clouded with concern. "Sarah, you can't let them get away with this," she said, her voice a mixture of frustration and sympathy. "You have to fight back. Report them again. Do something." Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling. "I've tried. No one listens. The school doesn't care, Melissa." Her friend hesitated, then placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Then make them care. You're stronger than this. Don't let them win." But even Melissa's encouragement couldn't soften the bitterness Sarah felt. Back in class, she caught the sympathetic glances of a few classmates, but none dared to stand up for her. Even Brandon, A quiet second-year student who had recorded the presentation fiasco on his phone seemed too afraid to act. "I'm going to show this to Patterson," Brandon confided to Melissa during lunch, holding up his phone. "But what if Jake finds out? I don't want to end up like her." Melissa's jaw tightened as she snatched the phone from his hand. "Then let me handle it," she snapped, her voice laced with frustration. The tension came to a head that afternoon. As Sarah retrieved her books from her locker, Jake sauntered up and yanked the door open further, bending the metal hinges with deliberate force. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Guess you'll need a new locker." Sarah's pulse quickened, her teeth clenching as she fought the urge to lash out. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake laughed, his grin widening. "What's that? Speak up, Collins. You've got some fight in you, don't you?" When he reached for her notebook, she snapped. Gripping it tightly, she yanked it back with a force that surprised even herself. "You don't have the right to treat me like this," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. For a brief moment, the hallway fell silent, students pausing to witness the rare defiance from the usually quiet Sarah. Jake's smirk faltered, but Liam and Travis quickly stepped in, their mocking laughter filling the void. "Oh, you're brave now," Liam jeered. "Let's see how long that lasts." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anger and anxiety. Sarah avoided Melissa's concerned gaze, her thoughts consumed by the inevitability of retaliation. That evening, at the gym, she punched the heavy bag with a ferocity that left her hands shaking and her arms sore. Coach Martinez watched from the sidelines, his brows furrowed in concern. "Something's eating at you, Collins," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Talk to me." Sarah hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "It's the kids at school. They keep pushing me, and I don't know how much longer I can hold back." Martinez nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Fighting's a last resort. You know that. But if it comes to it, remember your training. Keep your head clear. Your body can't win if your mind's a mess." His words stayed with her as she walked home under the dim streetlights. The shadows seemed heavier, the night colder, and Sarah felt the storm inside her brewing. Her fists clenched at her sides, the memory of Jake's smug grin pushing her closer to the edge. In her room, she stared at the gloves on her desk, their worn leather a reminder of the strength she had built over the years. "You don't have to be like them," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she feared it might be the only way to stop them. She drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of the school's hallways twisting into a boxing ring, Jake's face leering at her from the shadows. When she woke, drenched in sweat, she knew the line between her control and her anger was thinner than ever. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. Sarah's mornings had become a ritual of steeling herself. She pulled her hoodie tightly over her head, her gym bag slung across her back like armor. The school halls seemed narrower, the walls closing in, and the faces around her blurred into one oppressive mass. Every whispered conversation, every glance, felt like it was aimed at her. Jake's presence loomed even when he wasn't there. Her resolve was thinning. The mantra Coach Martinez had drilled into her, "Control your power, stay focused," echoed in her mind, but the weight of restraint was unbearable. The gym offered temporary solace, but every punch she landed on the bag felt like a betrayal of her instincts. She wasn't hitting Jake. She wasn't stopping the storm. It was on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday that Sarah's limits were tested. Her day began like any other, her steps heavy as she approached her locker. She didn't notice the change at first, too focused on pulling out her textbooks. Then she saw them, her gloves. The ones her father had given her, the gloves that had carried her through 4 years of training. They were slashed to shreds, the leather hanging in jagged strips. A piece of paper was wedged between them, bearing scrawled words, "Fat losers don't need gloves." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred, the edges of her world tilting. She pressed her hands against the cool metal of her locker, grounding herself. Her mind raced, alternating between anger and despair. Why couldn't they leave her alone? Why did they have to destroy the one thing that truly belonged to her? Melissa found her minutes later, The note crumpled in Sarah's hand. "Sarah," Melissa whispered, her voice tight with concern. "What happened?" Sarah couldn't answer. She shoved the gloves into her bag, the fragments of her calm unraveling. "They ruined them," she finally said, her voice hollow. "My gloves." Her words trailed off, choked by the lump in her throat. Melissa's face hardened, her usual optimism replaced by anger. "This isn't just bullying anymore," she said. "This is personal. We have to report this." I've already reported them," Sarah snapped, louder than she intended. Heads turned in the hallway, and Sarah felt her face flush. She lowered her voice. "It doesn't matter. No one listens." Melissa's eyes softened, but Sarah couldn't bear the pity. She turned away, walking blindly down the corridor until she found herself outside the principal's office. She hesitated, staring at the polished plaque with Patterson's name etched in gold. Her fists clenched at her sides. A part of her wanted to march inside and demand justice. But another part, the part that had been ignored time and time again, knew it would be futile. She turned and walked away. That afternoon, Coach Martinez noticed Sarah's distracted punches. She missed the bag entirely, her gloves swinging into empty air. "Stop," he barked, stepping into her line of sight. "What's going on?" Sarah's hands dropped to her sides, her shoulders slumping. "They destroyed my gloves," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones my dad gave me." Martinez's eyes darkened. "Who?" "It doesn't matter," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "What am I supposed to do, Coach?" "I'm trying to stay calm, but—" Her voice broke. "They're not stopping." Martinez crossed his arms, studying her. "Listen to me, Collins. You don't fight unless you have to. But if that time comes, you fight smart. Don't let anger take over. It'll make you sloppy. And remember, they're not your opponent. Your real opponent is losing control." Sarah nodded, but his words felt distant. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, a battle between action and restraint. The next day, the tension reached a boiling point. During lunch, Sarah sat alone at her usual spot by the window, her tray untouched. She stared out at the gray sky, her appetite swallowed by the knot in her stomach. She didn't notice Jake, Liam, and Travis approaching until it was too late. "Hey, Collins," Jake said, sliding into the seat across from her. His tone was mockingly casual, but his eyes gleamed with malice. "You look like you've seen better days." Sarah didn't respond. She focused on the rain trailing down the glass, willing herself to ignore him. Jake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, or are you just scared?" Liam and Travis laughed, their voices grating against Sarah's nerves. She felt the blood pounding in her ears, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. Then Jake did something she couldn't ignore. He reached out and flicked her tray, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the cafeteria, drawing the attention of every nearby table. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tiles. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Jake smirked, rising to meet her. "What's the matter, Collins?" he sneered. "Finally ready to do something about it?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's fists clenched, her body taut with unspent energy. She could feel every muscle coiled, every nerve on edge. She saw herself lunging at him, landing a blow that would wipe the smirk off his face. But then she remembered Coach Martinez's words. "Don't let anger take over. Fight smart." She unclenched her fists and stepped back. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake and his cronies laughing in her wake. In the hallway, she leaned against a locker, her hands trembling. She felt defeated, humiliated. But there was also a flicker of something else, resolve. She wasn't going to let Jake win. Not like this. That evening, she stayed at the gym long after the other fighters had left. She worked the bag until her knuckles ached, until every ounce of anger had bled away into the rhythmic thud of her punches. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let them break her. Not again. The final bell rang on Friday afternoon, signaling the end of a long and grueling week. Sarah packed her books into her bag, moving with mechanical precision. She was the last to leave the classroom, preferring the empty hallways over the chaos of the rush to leave. The stillness was a brief reprieve, but her instincts told her it wouldn't last. Her steps echoed faintly as she made her way toward the exit. The corridors were nearly empty, save for a few scattered papers and the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Just as she reached the last turn, she felt a familiar tension crawl up her spine. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag as she quickened her pace. "Going somewhere, Collins?" Jake's voice sliced through the silence, stopping her in her tracks. She turned slowly to see him standing in the middle of the hallway, flanked by Liam and Travis. They blocked the exit, their figures casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah's heart pounded as her eyes darted between them, calculating her options. The weight of her gym bag suddenly felt heavier, the strap biting into her shoulder. Jake smirked, taking a step closer. "You've been acting tough lately. Thought we'd remind you who's really in charge." Liam snickered, pulling out his phone. "Might as well get this on video. Everyone's going to love seeing you put in your place." Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She shifted her stance instinctively, her feet shoulder-width apart, ready for what was coming. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jake laughed, a low, mocking sound. "Too late for that." He lunged first, shoving her hard enough to send her stumbling back against the lockers. The impact jarred her, the cold metal pressing into her shoulder blades. Her bag slipped from her grip, landing with a dull thud on the floor. Sarah straightened, her breath steadying despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She saw the moment Jake's smirk faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes as she squared her shoulders. "Last warning," she said, her voice low but steady. Jake laughed again, louder this time, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. "What are you gonna do, Collins? Cry?" He moved toward her again, but this time she was ready. As his hand reached out, she sidestepped, pivoting sharply. Her fist snapped forward, landing a clean jab against his chest. The force sent him stumbling back, his grin replaced by shock. For a moment, the hallway was silent, save for Jake's sharp intake of breath. Liam and Travis froze, their expressions a mix of disbelief and hesitation. "You little..." Jake lunged again, his movements fueled by anger. Sarah ducked under his swing, her muscles responding automatically, honed by years of practice. She delivered a sharp uppercut to his torso, forcing the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping. Liam, still clutching his phone, stepped forward as if to intervene. Sarah's glare stopped him in his tracks. "Stay out of this," she warned, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Travis hesitated, his weight shifting nervously. Unlike Liam, he seemed reluctant to step in, his gaze flickering between Jake and Sarah. Jake straightened, his face red with anger and humiliation. He charged again, but Sarah anticipated his moves. She sidestepped once more, using his momentum against him. A swift hook to his jaw sent him sprawling to the floor. Liam cursed under his breath, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering onto the tiles. Sarah turned toward him, her stance unwavering. "Pick it up and leave," she said, her voice steady but firm. Liam hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her stare. He grabbed his phone and took a step back. "Let's go," Travis muttered, tugging on Liam's sleeve. "This is stupid." Jake groaned from the floor, clutching his side as he tried to push himself up. "You're gonna regret this," he wheezed, his voice laced with venom. Sarah knelt down, her gaze level with his. "No," she said quietly. "You're the one who should regret it." She stood, her chest heaving with controlled breaths, and grabbed her bag. Her legs trembled as she walked past them, adrenaline leaving her body in waves. She didn't look back, her focus fixed on the doors ahead. The cold air hit her face as she stepped outside, her steps faltering as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Her hands were shaking, the adrenaline ebbing away and leaving a raw ache in its place. She flexed her fingers, her knuckles tender but unbroken. Sarah's mind raced on the way home. Had she crossed the line? Was she no better than them now? The questions swirled in her head, but beneath the uncertainty was a sense of relief. She had stood up for herself. For once, she hadn't been a victim. That night, she didn't go to the gym. She sat in her room, replaying the confrontation in her mind. The tension, the fear, the moment she realized she was capable of fighting back. But the victory felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge that it might not be the end. She glanced at her gloves, torn and battered but still hers. Taking a deep breath, she pulled them from her bag and ran her fingers over the worn leather. They were a reminder of her strength, a part of her that no one could destroy. She didn't know what Monday would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid anymore. By the time Sarah returned to school on Monday, the entire campus was buzzing with whispers. Over the weekend, a video of the confrontation in the hallway had made its way to social media. Liam's phone had captured everything before it slipped from his hand. The clip spread like wildfire, with students dissecting every punch, every dodge, every word. Walking through the halls that morning, Sarah felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. The quiet girl who had spent years shrinking into the background was now the center of attention. Some students whispered in awe, others in judgment, and a few with grudging respect. "She took him down," a boy muttered to his friend as Sarah passed. "Yeah, but violence." "That's not okay," his friend replied. Sarah kept her head high, even as the conflicting whispers pressed against her. She knew what she had done, and she wasn't ashamed. But the unease in the pit of her stomach told her this wasn't over. The tension in the cafeteria was palpable at lunch. Jake sat at a corner table, his jaw bruised and his pride visibly battered. Liam and Travis were quieter than usual, their smugness replaced by caution. Across the room, Melissa waved Sarah over, her expression a mix of worry and pride. "You're famous," Melissa said as Sarah sat down. "That video? It's everywhere. People are even sharing it outside of school." Sarah groaned, setting her tray down. "That's just what I need. More attention." Melissa leaned in, her voice dropping. "Some of the teachers know about it. And Patterson's probably seen it too. If they call you in, you have to tell them the truth. Self-defense. Clear as day." Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened at the thought of another confrontation. "I didn't start it. They know that." Melissa hesitated, then said, "Brandon showed me something. He's been recording the bullying for weeks. If they try to pin this on you, we've got proof." Relief flickered in Sarah's chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by a lingering dread. Proof or not, she knew Jake wouldn't take this lying down. Her fears were confirmed during her last class of the day. Principal Patterson's voice crackled over the intercom, calling her to his office. Sarah's stomach churned as she gathered her things, her classmates watching her with thinly veiled curiosity. The walk to the office felt endless, each step heavy with anticipation. When she entered, Patterson was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Beside him was Coach Martinez, his arms crossed and his face drawn in a tight line. "Miss Collins," Patterson began, gesturing for her to sit. "Do you know why you're here?" Sarah met his gaze, steady despite the knot in her chest. "I assume it's about the fight." Patterson leaned back, folding his hands. "The video has caused quite a stir. Some say you were defending yourself. Others think you crossed a line. I'd like to hear your side." Sarah inhaled deeply, choosing her words carefully. "They've been bullying me for years. I've reported it more times than I can count, but nothing changed. On Friday, they cornered me. Jake pushed me. I warned him to stop, but he didn't." Patterson's eyes narrowed. "And you thought violence was the answer?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "But I wasn't going to let them hurt me. I defended myself. That's all." Martinez cleared his throat, drawing both their attention. "I've seen what this kid's been dealing with, Patterson. If you're going to blame anyone, blame the ones who've been pushing her to this point." Patterson frowned, but before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Melissa and Brandon stepped in, Brandon clutching his phone. "We have evidence," Melissa said, her voice unwavering. "Jake and his friends have been targeting Sarah for months. This video shows everything." Patterson watched in silence as Brandon played the clips. The scenes of relentless taunts, stolen belongings, and public humiliation were undeniable. When the last video ended, Patterson's expression was grim. "This is troubling," he admitted, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Collins, you're free to go. We'll handle this matter internally." As Sarah stood, relief flooding her, Patterson added, "But remember, any further physical altercations will not be tolerated." She nodded, biting back a retort, and left the office with Melissa and Brandon. Outside, Melissa grinned. "That was incredible. You stood your ground, and they finally listened." Brandon handed Sarah his phone. "You should keep these, just in case." Sarah took it, her fingers brushing the edges of the case. "Thanks, both of you." The rest of the day passed quietly, but Sarah remained cautious. That evening, she returned to the gym, her focus sharper than ever. As she worked the heavy bag, Martinez approached, his tone softer than usual. "You did good today," he said. "But remember, this isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to walk away." Sarah nodded, sweat dripping from her brow. "I know. But sometimes, walking away doesn't stop them." Martinez placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then make sure, when you fight, it's for the right reasons. And never let them take your control." Sarah met his gaze, her resolve hardening. She knew the battle wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. For the first time in years, she felt strong. Not just in body, but in spirit. Whatever came next, she was ready. The atmosphere at Oakwood High had shifted in the days following the confrontation. Jake, Liam, and Travis were noticeably absent from the hallways, their suspension announced quietly but felt loudly. The trio's reign of terror was over, and the student body was left to process the fallout. Sarah walked into school that Monday morning with a newfound sense of confidence. Whispers followed her, but they no longer felt like daggers. Instead, they carried an air of respect, curiosity, and, for some, guilt. For the first time, she wasn't defined by the cruel narratives of her tormentors. She was her own story now. As she passed the lockers, Brandon caught up to her, a sheepish smile on his face. "Hey," he began, holding out a flash drive. "I put all the videos on this, just in case you ever need them again." Sarah accepted it with a nod of gratitude. "Thanks, Brandon, for everything." He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "I should have spoken up sooner. I didn't want to be their next target." Sarah's expression softened. "I get it. But you stood up when it mattered. That's what counts." Their conversation was interrupted by the loudspeaker crackling to life. Principal Patterson's voice rang out. "Attention, students. This Friday, we'll be hosting an anti-bullying assembly in the auditorium. Attendance is mandatory." Sarah raised an eyebrow, exchanging a glance with Brandon. "That's new." By lunchtime, the details of the assembly had spread. Rumor had it that Sarah's story would be at the center of it, used as an example of resilience and self-defense. The thought made her stomach twist. She wasn't looking for recognition, she just wanted peace. Melissa joined her at their usual spot by the window, a wide grin on her face. "They're finally doing something," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. "Can you believe it?" Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "I'll believe it when I see it." Friday arrived quicker than she expected. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in, their voices a low hum. Sarah sat near the back, her heart pounding as Patterson took the stage. The assembly began with a series of presentations about the impact of bullying, accompanied by slides of statistics and generic platitudes. Sarah's attention drifted until Patterson cleared his throat, signaling the final segment. "We've all seen the video," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "And while it's clear that self-defense played a role, the events leading up to it are unacceptable. Today, We're taking steps to ensure something like this never happens again." He gestured to Coach Martinez, who stepped onto the stage. The coach scanned the crowd, his presence commanding immediate silence. "Violence is never the first answer," Martinez began, his voice steady. "But knowing how to defend yourself is crucial. That's why, starting next month, Oakwood High will host weekly self-defense workshops. They'll be open to all students, free of charge." A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Sarah sat straighter, her eyes widening in surprise. Melissa nudged her with an excited grin. Martinez continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "These workshops aren't just about fighting. They're about building confidence, learning discipline, and understanding that your strength comes from within." He paused, his eyes landing briefly on Sarah. "It's about standing up for yourself without losing who you are." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew louder. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, pride, relief, and a lingering nervousness about what came next. After the assembly, Patterson approached Sarah in the hallway. "Miss Collins," he began, his tone softer than she was used to, "I wanted to thank you. Your courage has sparked change here. I know it hasn't been easy." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. "Just make sure it actually changes." Patterson smiled faintly, giving her a small nod before walking away. In the following weeks, the workshops began, led by Martinez with Sarah occasionally helping to demonstrate techniques. The sessions quickly grew in popularity, with students from all walks of life joining in. For some, it was about learning to fight back. For others, it was about finding their own strength. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, not as a victim but as a leader. She guided younger students, shared her experiences, and slowly began to heal from the scars of the past. The workshops became more than just classes, they became a community. One afternoon, Melissa approached Sarah as they packed up the mats in the gym. "You know, you've changed everything," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "People are standing up for themselves because of you." Sarah glanced around at the students laughing and chatting as they left the gym. For the first time in a long while, the walls of Oakwood High felt lighter. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was everyone who chose to fight back in their own way." The semester ended with an unexpected ceremony. The school presented Sarah with a certificate of honor for her resilience and contribution to the community. As she stood on the stage, her parents watching proudly from the audience, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. When the applause died down, she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else feels powerless. It's about standing up for each other, even when it's hard. Together, we're stronger." The auditorium erupted into cheers, and for the first time, Sarah smiled without reservation. The storm that had loomed over her for so long was finally gone, replaced by the calm of a new beginning. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.